Good morning and assalamu alaikum, girls. So, welcome to our second session of Derrida's essay, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of Human Sciences. So, we'll be continuing with the various points of the essay, and we have already seen some basic concepts that are discussed in the essay. Now, we have a few more points to deal with where Derrida is taking the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss' ideas, and he is trying to argue against those concepts. So let's start. So first we have nature versus culture. That is one point that is highlighted by Derrida. Claude Lévi-Strauss had actually introduced this idea of binaries. That is a very classic example. He devises two categories of binaries, nature and culture. According to Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was a popular French anthropologist of the time, according to Lévi-Strauss, what it was that everything could be divided into either nature or culture. Nature, that is anything that is spontaneous, anything that is universal, that is common, that is very natural, that is, innate, inborn in us, that is nature. Okay, and anything that is acquired, that we acquire through our culture, is cultural. Okay, so these are the two aspects, nature and culture. Everything could be divided into either these two binaries. A very prominent classical binary is nature and culture. Now Derrida opposes this concept of this classical binary of the nature and culture with something called the scandal. That's a very important concept you have to remember. He opposes the binary nature versus culture with scandal. Now what is scandal? To explain this concept of scandal, he gives you the idea of incest prohibition that is used, which is both universal as well as cultural. Now what is incest? Now incest, with the idea of incest prohibition, incest is something that is, basically it means unlawful sexual relationship, especially between close relations or family members, etc. So this kind of unlawful sexual relations is what is meant by incest. So this idea of incest prohibition, it is something very natural, it is something very universal, right? In whatever time you take, in whatever era you take, in whatever age you refer, you can find that incest has been prohibited everywhere. It is something that was considered wrong, it was something that was prohibited, it was something that was very evil at any time. So in that sense, incest prohibition is something that is very universal, very natural, very common. So it comes under nature. But at the same time, there is something cultural about it too. For example, the example that we, Derrida gives in the essay here is that, for example, he says in different cultures, for example, according to certain religions, some relations are considered actually lawful, So in some religions, for example, in the Muslim religion, marriage between cousins is lawful. At the same time, in some religion, such marriages are considered unlawful. It is a part of incest. It is considered incest. It is considered prohibited, etc. So sometimes such relations, such concepts are universal. At the same time, it is cultural. So with this, Derrida is giving an example. This is just an example that Derrida gives, and with this example he is opposing this binary of nature versus culture, that this opposition is not there. Derrida have always been against this binary opposition, so he is also opposing this nature versus culture concept by Lévi-Strauss. Now moving on, we have the bricolage and the bricoleur. Now, this is again taken from the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss' essay, The Savage Mind. Okay, now in the essay by Claude Lévi-Strauss, the essay's name is The Savage Mind. He gives the concept of bricolage and bricoleur. Bricolage is an act where you make use of anything that you have to create something. That is what is a bricolage. Just remember, like collage, so like that, bricolage. Okay, now bricolaire is a person who does that. Now bricolaire is a person who uses the mean at his disposal, any means at his disposal, whatever tools he have, whatever equipments he have, he's using that in desired permutations, in desired amount, permutation meaning in amounts or combinations, as he wishes to reach the end goal. So his goal is to make something, then he will use whatever he has to make that. Okay, that is what is a bricolaire. Bricolaire is a person who does bricolage. Okay. Now, Levi-Strauss, he places the binary opposition of a bricolaire to that of an engineer. An engineer is an example he gives, and not an example, is the opposition he gives. It is a binary opposition of a bricolaire. Now, engineer is someone who builds structures that are coherent, stable, that have a fixed center and have an absolute truth value. Now, in Western philosophy, the engineer is always privileged. Engineer is always considered superior, in opposition to bricolaire. Now, Claude Lévi-Strauss, he discusses bricolage not only as an intellectual exercise, it's not only as making things, but also as a mythopoetical activity, that is in making of myth. Okay. Now, the example that Lévi-Strauss gives is that a bricolaire is a savage mind. A bricolaire is the savage mind who puts pre-existing things together in new ways and makes do with whatever is at hand and makes whatever he can with those things. Now, Levi-Strauss points out that the signs already in existence, that is, already some things are there, but you have a toothbrush, but that toothbrush is used for brushing your teeth. Now, a bricolaire might use a toothbrush as a stand in which he can build something. Okay, so he uses signs already in existence. It can be used in language also. That is what is meant by mythopoetical activity, making of myth. So the signs that are already in existence, and it is used for purposes that they are not actually meant for. So the working of the bricolaire is parallel to the construction of mythological narratives. When you're creating mythological narratives, it's like a work of a bricolaire. Whereas the engineer is the scientific mind. That is what is, according to the Western philosophy, the Western scientific mind is the engineer. The mythological mind is the bricolaire. That is the difference. Engineer is very specific, scientific mind, a very true craftsman. He deals with everything that is very correct, taking into account the availability of materials, creating new tools, making everything very perfect. He has a particular structure. An engineer might have a particular center. An engineer might have a particular focus. So the engineer is the scientific, the Western scientific mind, whereas the bricolaire is the mythological narratives, creating of mythologies. Okay. So, drawing a parallel, Levi-Strauss argues that mythology functions more like a bricolaire, whereas modern Western science works more like an engineer. So, that is one difference, example that he gives for that. Bricolaire is like the mythology, creates mythology, whereas the engineer creates modern Western science. Now, what did Derrida have to say about that? Now, Derrida, in his essays, Structure, Sign and Play, he actually criticizes Derrida has always been criticizing others. So, Derrida actually criticizes Levi-Strauss' concept. He says that bricolaire doesn't actually care about the purity or stability or truth of his system he or she uses. Bricolaire does not imagine that, does not look like, if I look at this concept and if I think of this myth, or if I take this story and mix this with this story, will it be correct? Will it be beautiful? Will it be exact? But rather he uses what's available to get the job done. That is what a bricolaire does. So according to Derrida, since every discourse that borrows its ideas from the sites, coherent or not, is a bricolaire, and an engineer too creates structure and discourse, limited or not, from within itself. So actually when you think of it, engineer or the Western scientific mind, they actually uses things around them, right? Concepts and ideas around them to create this scientific structure, or to create this idea, scientific idea, or whatever it is. So every discourse is borrowed from here and there. So in that sense, engineer is also a bricolayer. So again here Derrida is diluting or removing this opposition. So the opposition between a bricolayer and an engineer, which was proposed by Levi-Strauss, is diluted here, and the engineer becomes a myth created by bricolayer. Okay, and Derrida gives an example that the critical language is a bricolage. Actually, the criticisms that we have, the critical languages that we have, it is a bricolage, because we use the tools that are available. We use literature that is available to critically analyze it. Edward Said had already taken this book from the library, Mansfield Park, written by Jane Austen, and he had critically analyzed it. So what Edward Said is doing there, he is a bricolayer who is creating things from something that's already there. Okay, so whatever he got in his hand, he is doing something with that. So that is what is critical language, is actually a bricolage, and we are using what we have. Now coming to the conclusion of the essay, so these were some of the important points that Derrida speaks of in his essay. Just remember it few point by point, and coming to the conclusion, we have Derrida, who observes that there are two ways to interpret structure, sign and play. Okay, two ways are there to interpret structure, sign and play. One aims to decipher an absolute truth. So one way to interpret structure, sign and play is by deciphering absolute truth, that is making use of the structure as it is, and the other one affirms play, that is other method that affirms play, meaning that affirms free play, that is without the center. So one method is by having the center, using this absolute truth, means the absolute center, and then avoiding play, avoiding this free play. That is what is limited, what is very traditional way. That is the very traditional way that we use. Now the other second method is by affirming play. Affirming meaning supporting play, supporting free play meaning without center. That is the modern concept. Okay, so either you can interpret a structure in the traditional way, or you can use it by the modern concept. Now the first way, that is the way in which the center was dominant and free play was limited. That way was dominant throughout human history. Okay, that is the method that we have been using in history or throughout human history, and the second way is only emerging now, that is deconstruction. Okay, so the second way is which proposed, not actually deconstruction. Deconstruction is just a philosophy. The second method is one in which without the center you have unlimited free play, infinite free play. For Derrida, play must supersede the alternatives of presence and absence, and hence there is no need to be concerned with the absence of center or of origin. So actually for Derrida, this play, that is free play, it must supersede the alternative. You don't have to think whether there is a center, whether there is a structure, whether there is some truth in it, whether there is some reality in it. You have to create discourse. That is all that matters. So there is no need to be concerned with whether it is right or wrong. Okay, basically that is what he is trying to say, that limitless play, infinite play should be what can we say, advocated or inspired. There is no need to be concerned with the absence of center or origin. You don't have to be concerned, oh, we don't have a center now, so it's very wrong what we are doing. There is no one to control us, so it's very it's very wrong what we are doing. So there is no need to think that we need a center. A center is something that could be there, that cannot be there. So it's not important. Play is possible if we can forego our need for truth. That is, we always have this need for, always adhering to a center, for adhering to this concept or following this concept, a center. So play is possible if we can forego. Forego means avoid this center. It is possible then to have a philosophy without concepts, without orientation, without coherence. So we can have something very pure. Okay. So Derrida is saying, if there is no center, if there is no one to control you, you can have limitless opportunities, you can have limitless expressions, you can have limitless thoughts, you can have limitless imaginations. So everything will be limitless. So it is possible to have a philosophy without any concept or without any orientation or without any center, without coherence. So this limitless concept is what is promoted by Derrida in his essay. So this is what we have in the essay. So I hope it was clear. The last video, do watch that video after watching the second video. So together you will get a relatively good idea about what the essay is saying. Anyway, in this class we spoke about nature versus culture, how Levi-Strauss' ideas of binaries were criticized or opposed by Derrida by saying this concept of scandal, and he gave the example of incest prohibition, sexual relationship between close relations, or prohibited sexual acts. This is what was prohibited, and it is both universal as well as cultural. So it is something that dilutes this opposition between nature and culture. And then we have bricolage and bricoleur, which is actually terminology is taken from the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who promoted it in his book The Savage Mind, where bricoleur is the savage mind, the engineer is the scientific mind. Okay. Then Derrida, in the next slide we spoke of Derrida, how he criticizes this concept, and he says actually the engineer is a myth created by bricoleur, and again this opposition is also diluted, and Derrida gives the example that critical language is actually bricolage, because we are forced to use the tools that are available. And then coming to the conclusion, we are seeing how Derrida is saying you can either take this absolute truth or follow the center and avoid limitless play, or you can follow the structure where there is no structure, there is no center, and there is limitless play. Okay, so thank you girls.